If you want to hear about the undiscovered rooms of the nerve gas house that we never see in the movie, then stick around to the end of this video.
Greetings and welcome
To Things You Missed. I love how cheerfully he says greetings, gets me every time. Director James Wan would step away from the Saw franchise after the first film and open the door.
Somebody open the f***ing door!
For a new face to take the reins on the series. So Saw 2 would be directed by Darren Lynn Bousman. Bousman would head up the next 3 movies and establish most of what we think of when we think of Saw today. I'd consider the Saw saga to be more his product than any other director, and he would return to direct the 9th installment, Spiral. With the new director came some new things you missed, so grab your magnifying glass and let's get into them. The movie opens the same way that the first did, with a light. We see a bare light bulb come in and out of focus, and it suddenly shines very bright. In the first Saw, I said that the light represented Jigsaw, trying to enlighten his test subjects and make them see the error of their ways. That concept took more of a center stage in Saw 2, making this an appropriate opening. Some of John's trap designs throughout the Saw series took ancient torture devices and enhanced them with industrial advances. One example is the first trap of the movie, the Venus flytrap, which drew inspiration from the medieval contraption, the Iron Maiden. Only this was more like a cute little Iron Maiden for your face. When the victim watches his tape, the assistant seen on screen has a bit of a limp. There's a slight hobble to his step. If you've seen the twist at the end of Saw 7, you now know why. If you're about to correct me and say it's called Saw 3D or Saw the Final Chapter, save your breath. I prefer to call it Saw 7. Soon after, we meet Eric Matthews, who is going to pick up his son Daniel, who'd been caught shoplifting at an electronics store. During the scene, the camera cuts away to a shot of a security camera, which shows us the reason that Daniel is so familiar with security technology later on.
Those types of cameras don't have sound.
And more importantly, establish one of the main concepts of Jigsaw's next game. Part of what makes the twist work is the fact that we, as the audience, believe that what we're seeing on the monitors is a live feed. On a side note, this is one of the only movies to establish a relationship that we care about, the father-son dynamic between Eric and Daniel, before they both get tangled up with Jigsaw, and it goes a long way to help make this the most powerful entry in the series on an emotional level. Eric is called in to see the Jigsaw crime scene that we saw in the opening because the killer has called out Detective Matthews. Or rather, Detective Matthews. As brilliant as Jigsaw may have been, it looks like he still struggles with spelling. We know that the double T's is the correct spelling because that's how the names appear in the end credits. When Eric is back at the police station, many notices and wanted posters cover the walls, while the shelves are filled with binders and boxes of evidence files. One of these boxes is for a case about a victim named Greg Copeland, a reference to the co-producer of Bousman's initial 3 Saw films, who also served as a production manager and second unit director. Another box in that room lists a victim named Charlie Taylor, who is the film's weapons wrangler. After Matthews has the realization about the location of Jigsaw's hideouts, the SWAT team makes an entrance strategy on the whiteboard, which involved several smaller teams of men. The first team consisted of Black, Faulkner, Wisman, and Brady, which corresponded to electrician Craig Black, key grip Chris Faulkner, or possibly his brother Tyler, first assistant editor Ron Wisman Jr., and the art director Michelle Brady. Okay, enough of that boring stuff. You know shit's about to go down when Jigsaw puts away his cereal. The main game of Saw 2 is the nerve gas house, where 8 criminals must solve puzzles to win the antidotes to the poison being pumped in through the ventilation system. From what I've heard, the original scripts of the film have detailed the specific traps set for each character, but the final cut only shows the location of 5 antidotes. The one in the safe in the room that they start off in, the 2 in the furnace trap, the 1 in the needle pit, and the 1 in the razor box. Of those 5, only 1 game was played by the test subject it was intended for, which was Abby, who was challenged to go into the furnace trap. According to the director's commentary, the razor box trap was intended for Gus, who doesn't make it that far because he falls victim to the magnum eye hole very early on. Normally I wouldn't consider the information on the commentary track canon, so I wouldn't include something like that in my things you missed, but we do see that Gus is a businessman and the trap seems to have been created to punish greed. It's not hard to imagine that Gus was chosen by Jigsaw because of corporate greed. We more or less find out why Addison was chosen in Saw 4, and the razor box trap doesn't seem to fit the bill for prostitution. So who were the other antidotes supposed to go to? In my headcanon, the second needle in Abby's trap would have gone to Daniel, since he's just a kid and you know all the usual cliches about him having his whole life ahead of him and stuff. I'm not saying that the other prisoners would have let that happen, but I think that's how Jigsaw drew up the game. The only other one that we know for a fact is the needle pit trap, which was intended for Xavier, but he ends up throwing Amanda into the pit to do the task for him. Speaking of which, I think we can subtract 1 because it seems pretty clear that because Amanda was in on the game, she had already been treated. This is supported by the fact that she never runs out of breath or spits up blood as the others do. So that leaves Laura, Addison, and Jonas. I think that the antidote in the safe would have been for Jonas because he seems most interested in solving the riddle that Jigsaw left for them on the tape, so it's likely that John knew that he liked puzzles and that would essentially become his task. So that just leaves Addison and Laura. There are plenty of locked rooms in the corridors that we never see the inside of, and some of them seem to just open on their own once a certain amount of time has elapsed, but neither of these characters lived long enough to make it to their tests. While we don't see the inside of their rooms in the movie, we can learn about the traps that may have been inside them if we take a closer look at the design sketches pinned up all over Jigsaw's workshop. John Kramer's headquarters at the Wilson Steel plant seem to be his go-to spot for research and development. Taking a look around, the place is covered with blueprints, design sketches, and prototypes for traps, which were tested on the mannequins scattered around the facility, which were probably brought over from his previous workshop at Stygian Street, whose location had been compromised by Detective Tapp in 2004. These designs include previous traps, like the original reverse bear trap, which we saw Amanda tested on in the first movie, or the Venus flytrap from the opening of this movie. Many of the sketches represent the traps at the nerve gas house, like the razor box and the Magnum eye hole. If those are present, chances are we can also see the two unseen traps from the nerve gas house, the ones intended for Laura and Addison. There are a number of traps that can be seen in the workshop that don't correspond to any trap that's used during the series, like this one, which appears to be some kind of skull cage, possibly with the intention of impaling the victim's head. Another variation on the idea shows up later and looks to introduce an electric shock component to the design. Another design shows us some kind of gas mask with a switch on the front. When we see more concept sketches later, one of them is labeled as the toxin table, though it is not known if that is meant to be used in conjunction with the gas mask. This thing may or may not be the toxin table. Assuming the gas mask and the toxin table do go together though, I'd guess this is the trap for Addison. I can see there being some kind of analogy being made, with toxins being compared to disease and the gas mask being compared to protection as it pertains to the corner girl lifestyle. We don't ever find out why Laura is tested by Jigsaw, but she would have the last trap by default, be it the electric skull cage thing or one of these other prototypes. Another possibility is this football helmet one, but there isn't any evidence of John getting started with any preliminary designs on that. There are other trap designs that I think may be very early versions of some of the other devices John would use later in his career. Would you call serial killing a career? I mean, I guess in his case, it's more of a retirement plan.
Hello, investment firms. I see that you fraudulently mishandled funds for my 401k. I can't do this.
But yeah, right here I noticed a trap that looks to be some kind of spinal cord device, which reminded me of the spine cutter trap that Art Blank had to wear in Saw 4. There was also this mannequin with a series of tubes running from the head, and I have to wonder if that would be related to the oxygen crusher that eventually appeared in Saw 6. Outside of what we actually see in John's workshop, there is also a moment that I believe inspired future traps in the series. When John is talking to Detective Matthews, he describes the moment that his mission truly began, when he tried to take himself out Bill Murray Groundhog Day style. And the way he describes what he felt is an important step in how he came to believe that his traps would cause people to appreciate life. Roll it off the side of a cliff.
But to my amazement, I was alive. And I was determined to spend the rest of my days testing the fabric of human nature.
The obvious trap idea to come out of this would be the horsepower trap from Saw 7, where one of the victims experiences a car crash from the same perspective that John would have when he threw his vehicle into autopilot, but there was no autopilot because it was the mid-90s. But after the crash, John can be seen pulling these stakes out of his body. And I think that's what gave him the idea for the spike trap, which he would use in Saw 4? Guys, I am so good at reading Roman numerals. As this seems to be the part of the experience that really made him feel alive. But enough about the traps, let's talk about the game.
This whole house is a trap!
Touché. At the very beginning, Amanda is asleep, face down on the floor like she's some kind of Taking Back Sunday lyric. Though if anyone's a lyric in this movie, it's Rig. Amanda, who would be the facilitator of the game at the nerve gas house, starts off in the exact same position that John Kramer did when he facilitated the bathroom game a year prior. Eric's son Daniel is wearing some band merch for a group called Wrath of the Gods. Those of you who saw my Things You Missed episode on the first Saw may remember a character named Scott Tibbs, who was Adam's childhood best friend, who also went on to make his own documentary about Jigsaw. Scott's band in that documentary is none other than Wrath of the Gods.
Hey, Scott Tibbs, lead guitar, founder of Wrath of the Gods.
Last week I said that the Scott Tibbs documentary was non-canon, but after watching it again, there isn't really anything that contradicts the movies, so I'm not sure why Saw fans consider it to be non-canon. I think it's just because they don't like it. But outside of Daniel's Wrath of the Gods shirt being a reference to Scott Tibbs, it also represents the cult of Jigsaw, who would come to see himself as a god. So you could say that he brought his wrath down upon his many victims. This wrath would not extend to Daniel himself though, and Jigsaw gives a couple of little clues towards the boy being safe. Or at least being in a safe.
Tell me where he is.
He's in a safe place.
Also, later on, when he promises Eric that if he follows the rules he'll see his son again, he darts his eyes down towards where the safe is.
If you agree to that, then you will see your son again.
These clues given audibly by Jigsaw aren't the only hints that what the police are seeing on the screens isn't taking place in real time. If we look at some more of the background details of the workshop, we can find even more evidence. When police discover the numbers counting down next to the monitors, they assume that it's a bomb, and later decide that it's probably a countdown to the end of the nerve gas game. However, if you do the math, which normally I don't like to do, but we'll make an exception for you, the viewers, the timer has over 4 hours to go, whereas the game was only supposed to last 2 to 3 hours.
3 hours from now, the door to this house will open. Unfortunately, you only have 2 hours to live.
There are also a few items seen in both the nerve gas house and the Wilson steel plant. Items don't typically exist in 2 places at once. What I'm getting at is the events taking place on the computer screens cannot be taking place at the same time as the police raid. The wheelchair with the mannequin upon which the note for Abby is found can be seen in the room with the monitors. The tricycle that Billy the puppet used to greet the police when they first arrived at the steel plant is also present in the hallway over at the house, and the X marks the spot painting can be seen hanging in the background in Jigsaw's workshop. Earlier I mentioned briefly how Jigsaw developed a god complex, and this painting has a very biblical look to it, like something you might find in a church. He probably does consider his workshops to be his churches, going so far as to light candles to perform a ceremony on Amanda in Saw 3. The signal traced by the Metropolitan Police's tech team leads them back to a different house, where Rigg hits pause in the VCR to determine that the game that they had been watching on the screens all along was already over. One question you might have had is where Jigsaw is getting all of these empty houses and buildings. Fans of the franchise know that John Kramer was once involved in a project called the Urban Renewal Group, which helps provide housing to low-income families, but he abandoned the endeavor halfway through. I think that the nerve gas house was going to be one of these homes, but John reinforced it to make it the setting of his game. The fake-out house was probably a replica or model home, which would explain why it has the same layout and why Jigsaw was able to trick the SWAT team. The twist in this movie works great because as the audience, we're on the same level as the protagonists, the police. We are being presented the events out of order because that's how they are perceiving the situation. We find out the truth as they find out. Whereas in a movie like Jigsaw, the story is told the way that it is just to trick the audience. There's no other practical reason for doing it that way, and it feels artificial. Another thing that Saw 2 gets right that you may not have thought about is the theming of the traps to fit the character who is playing them. For example, it seems the needle pit room was once a nursery. We see ABCs written on the walls, baby bottles, toys, carriages, and even creepy little infant mannequins. Xavier is revealed to have been a drug dealer who took advantage of his clients' addictions. When a junkie becomes addicted, their body becomes dependent on the drugs. Just as a baby in a nursery needs its parents to provide for it, the drug addicts need to keep crawling back to Xavier to get their fix. Desperation seems to be a key theme in the film. Had Abby not been so desperate to get both antidotes, he could have seen the nozzle to turn off the flames of the furnace trap with minimal burn damage. Had Addison not been in such a huge rush to obtain the antidote in the razor box, she might have noticed that it was already unlocked, which would allow her to open it up and get what she needs without putting her wrists in harm's way. And had everyone just taken a moment to sit down and think about the clues given by Jigsaw,
The numbers are in the back of your mind. The clue to their order can be found over the rainbow.
they could have figured out that each of them had numbers written on the back of their heads, each one with a different color of the rainbow. By arranging them in the order of Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, they would have obtained the combination to the safe. The big one, of course, is Eric Matthews, whose desperation to find his son led him back to the ways of police brutality. All he had to do to get his son back was sit there and talk with a Jigsaw. When the contestants of the game discover the X, they find the photo proving that Daniel Matthews is Eric Matthews' son. In the photo, they're at a New York Knicks game. While the location of the Saw movies is in an unnamed fictional city that's only ever nicknamed the Fairweather States, there are a lot of clues like this that it's supposed to be somewhere in the northeastern United States, like the license plates being very similar to New Jersey and the New York skyline in the Spiral trailer.
Enjoy it while it lasts.
About 73 minutes into Saw 2, there's this 3-minute stretch where there's just a whole bunch of horror references for some reason. It starts when the tech team discovers the location of the fake-out house, which is 237 North Hyde Crescent. 237 is an homage to the spookiest number in all of horror, Room 237 from The Shining. If you aren't a big fan of The Shining, you might think this is just a coincidence, but trust me when I say it's not. If you pay attention, you'll notice this number come up over and over again in all kinds of horror films. The way that Hyde is spelled makes me think it could be a nod to the classic novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Then there's another potential street name homage.
Make a run on Alfred!
It's a bit unusual to see a first name used as a street name like that, and the murder mystery house nature of Saw 2 leads me to believe that this was a reference to perhaps the most iconic horror director of all time, Alfred Hitchcock. Another iconic horror director was Wes Craven, and his 1972 film Last House on the Left would also be mentioned on this car ride.
It's the last house on the left.
After this, we see the conclusion of the Nerve Gas House game.
Come on, let me in! Let me in! Let me in!
As I mentioned in the last episode, one of the staples of the Saw franchise is that there's always a character who plays dead in order to get an upper hand. In this case, it's Daniel, who plays dead to get the jump on Xavier. I can't show that because it's too gory for YouTube, but look, someone finally flushed the toilet. And that's one of the last things that I'd like to compliment Saw 2 on. It decided which aspects of the first movie would become staples of the series and set the tone that would be used for the next 5 installments. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about this really being Darren Lynn Bousman's franchise. He departed after Saw 4, but handed the torch to the production designer that he brought on for his Saw movies, David Hackle. And David would hand it off to the series editor, Kevin Reuter, to finish it out. So the team was all together as early as Saw 2, part of the reason that the tone is consistent. Saw 2 would establish Bousman as a director, but the biggest box office success in the franchise would be his next endeavor, Saw 3. So make sure you join me on the next episode of Things You Missed by subscribing to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ringing that death bell for notifications, and I will see you in the next one, assuming we both survive.